the year of our Lord, 1876, breathed dust, in the Arizona Territory, in a town called Dust Creek. It was the first and last thing you knew of the day. Dust was the film on the water in the basin, the grit in your teeth, the pale ghost that haunted the sun and turned every sunset into a blaze of bruised orange and red. It settled in the lines of a man's face and in the hems of a woman's dress, a fine powder of truth that said life here was a slow, grinding erosion. Sarah Whitmore knew the dust better than anyone. At 24, she had been born in it, raised in it, and felt it settling deep in her soul. She was the daughter of Sheriff Amos Whitmore, a fact that was both a shield and a cage. It gave her a certain standing, a respectful berth in the general store. But it also meant her life was not entirely her own. She was public property, a symbol of the law and order her father fought to maintain. Her reputation was as vital to Dust Creek's fragile peace as the bars on the jailhouse window. And like those bars, it kept her locked in. She was not a woman made for caging. Her shoulders were straight, her gaze was direct, and her hands, though she could handle a needle with passable skill, were more comfortable holding the reins of her temperamental buckskin horse, Sandman. She had her mother's dark hair, but her father's unyielding chin. She had never seen the world beyond the jagged peaks that ringed their valley, and the longing for it was a constant, low ache in her chest. Then Ellis Boone arrived, carried in on the same wind that brought the summer heat. He was the new deputy, a man her father had hired on the strength of a letter from a marshal in Texas. He was quiet, with eyes the color of a faded blue uniform that had seen too much sun and too much sorrow. He had fought in the war, on which side he never said, and it showed in the way he stood, always a little apart from everyone else, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. He moved with a stillness that was unsettling in a town of restless men. He did not boast, he did not swagger, he simply did his job. His presence, a steady, silent weight beside her father's booming authority. Dust Creek watched him. The men in the saloon measured him with wary glances. The women, the respectable wives and watchful mothers, saw the shadow of the war on him and whispered that he was not a settled man, that he carried a darkness with him. Sarah saw something else. She saw a quiet strength, a weariness that was not weakness, and an honor that did not need to announce itself. She saw a man as trapped by his past as she was by her present. Their lives would have run parallel, two straight lines in the dust, had it not been for the Crow's gang and a blistering Tuesday afternoon. Sarah had ridden out to the old Miller homestead, delivering a jar of her preserved peaches to the widow Martha, a task of charity that also served as a fine excuse to feel the wind in her hair and escape the suffocating propriety of town for a few hours. On her way back, with the sun slanting low and painting the desert in long, dramatic shadows, she heard the shots. It was not one or two, but a volley, sharp and angry, echoing off the canyon walls. It was followed by the unmistakable crack of a single, heavier rifle, a sound she knew well. A Winchester. Her father had taught her to shoot, to know the voice of every firearm as if it were a person's. That was Elias Boone's rifle. Caution told her to turn Sandman around and ride for town, for her father. But caution was a timid voice, and Sarah had never been good at listening to it. She nudged her horse into a dry wash, the sandy bottom muffling his hoofbeats, and followed the sound. She found them in a narrow pass between two red rock mesas. 3 men, grimy and mean-looking, were using a cluster of boulders for cover. Below them, in the open, was Elias. His horse was down, a still, dark shape in the sand. He was crouched behind the dead animal, firing sparingly, making every shot count. He was pinned. It was a coward's ambush. The Crow's gang. They were called vultures who preyed on lone riders and isolated ranches. They were not brave, just cruel. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and fury. She was no gunslinger, but she knew this land. She knew its secrets. Staying low in the wash, she circled around behind the ambushers, tying Sandman to a gnarled mesquite tree. She crept up the rocky slope on foot, her boots making no sound on the stone. She carried a small pistol in her saddlebag, a Colt meant for snakes, not men. It felt impossibly light in her hand. From her new vantage point, she could see the three men clearly. They were laughing, taking their time, enjoying the sport. One of them stood up to get a better angle, exposing himself for a heartbeat. Sarah did not think. She raised the pistol, aimed not for the man, but for the rock face just above his head, and fired. The bullet screamed off the stone, sending a spray of sharp fragments into the air. The man yelped and dropped, clutching his face. His companions, startled, spun around, trying to locate the source of the new threat. It was the opening Elias needed. The Winchester roared, and one of the men crumpled to the ground. The other two, their confidence shattered, scrambled for their horses and fled, vanishing into the maze of canyons. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps. She watched as Elias slowly rose from behind his dead horse, his rifle held ready. He scanned the ridge where she stood. His eyes narrowed. "You can come out," he called, his voice rough. "I owe you my thanks." She holstered her pistol and made her way down the slope, feeling clumsy and exposed. He met her at the bottom, his face grim, streaked with dust and sweat. There was a dark, wet stain spreading on his left sleeve. "You are hurt," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It is just a graze," he replied, his gaze intense. That was a fool thing to do. Miss Whitmore, and a brave one. "They were not giving you a fair fight," she said, tilting her chin. "Someone had to even the odds." A corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Well, I am in your debt." Before more could be said, the sky, which had been a clear, unforgiving blue, began to bruise. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The desert storms were sudden and violent, turning dry washes into raging rivers in minutes. "We need to find shelter," Elias said, looking at the darkening clouds. "My horse is gone. We will have to ride double." The thought of it, the proximity, sent a strange current through her. But there was no choice. He was injured, and the storm was coming fast. He took the saddle and bridle from his dead animal, his movements economical despite the pain in his arm. He loaded them onto Sandman before mounting, then reached a hand down to her. His grip was firm, calloused, and warm. She swung up behind him, settling on the horse's rump, her hands resting lightly on his hips to steady herself. She could feel the hard muscle of his back against her chest, smell the scent of gunpowder, sweat, and the clean, masculine scent that was uniquely his. They found shelter just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. It was an old line shack, abandoned years ago. Little more than 4 crumbling adobe walls and a partial roof of sun-bleached planks. But it was dry. They led the horse inside, and the world outside dissolved into a gray, roaring sheet of water. The air in the small space grew thick and close. A chill set in, and Elias, despite his protests, was starting to shiver, a sign of shock and blood loss. "You need to get that coat off," Sarah said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Let me see your arm." He hesitated, then complied, shrugging out of the heavy duster in his shirt. The wound was a deep, ugly gash along his forearm. It was bleeding sluggishly. Without a word, Sarah tore a long strip from the hem of her petticoat. It was scandalous, ruining a perfectly good garment, but she did not care. She cleaned the wound as best she could with water from her canteen and bound it tightly. Her fingers brushed against his skin, and an unexpected warmth shot up her arm. He stood perfectly still, watching her, his breathing slow and even. The storm raged on. Darkness fell, and the inside of the shack became a small pocket of intimacy. lit only by the occasional flash of lightning. They sat against the wall, a careful foot of space between them, and shared the last of her water and a stale biscuit from his saddlebag. The silence was not awkward. It was full of unspoken things, of the violence they had just shared and the strange peace that had followed. "Why did you come to Dust Creek, Deputy Boone?" she asked, her voice soft in the drumming rain. He was quiet for a long moment. "I was looking for a place where the past could not find me." "And can it?" "The past has long legs," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But Arizona is a big place. A man can hope." He shifted, turning his head to look at her in the gloom. "What about you, Miss Whitmore? You were born here. You ever think of leaving?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "Every day," she whispered, the confession startling her with its raw honesty. "What stops you?" "Duty, family. My father needs me. And fear," she added silently. "The fear of the unknown, of trading a familiar cage for a wilderness she might not survive." They talked for hours. He spoke of the war, not of the battles, but of the endless marching, the bitter cold, and the faces of the men he had known. She spoke of the town, of the small joys and the crushing weight of expectation, of her dreams of seeing an ocean, something she could only imagine from books, in the dark, surrounded by the storm. They were not the sheriff's daughter and the deputy. They were just Sarah and Elias, two people discovering a rare and startling connection, a recognition of the loneliness in each other's souls. A powerful gust of wind rattled the flimsy roof, and a shiver ran through her. Without a word, Elias took off his dry duster and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of him. The gesture was simple, protective, and it undid something inside her. He did not move closer, did not try to take advantage of the darkness and the solitude. He simply offered his warmth, a silent act of respect that meant more than any flowery compliment she had ever received. They fell asleep like that, separated by a few inches of dusty floor, but connected by a current of awareness that was as powerful and undeniable as the storm outside. The dawn broke clear and clean. The desert washed new. The air was cool and smelled of creosote. They rode back to Dust Creek in a comfortable silence, the world looking different than it had the day before. But as the first buildings of the town came into view, Sarah felt the old familiar cage closing back around her. They entered from the south end of the main street. It was early, but not so early that the town was asleep. Martha Gable was sweeping the porch of her small house, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. Beatrice Miller, the Reverend's wife, was on her way to the general store, her basket on her arm. Both women stopped. They saw Sarah, her hair undone and tangled, riding behind the new deputy. Wearing his coat, they saw his horse was missing, that his arm was bandaged with what looked suspiciously like a strip of petticoat. They saw two people returning at dawn from a night spent alone in the desert. Their eyes widened. A look passed between them, a silent exchange of information and judgment. By the time Sarah had dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, the story had already been written. It was a story of passion and impropriety, a scandalous tale that would be whispered over sewing circles and fence posts before the sun was high in the sky. The truth did not stand a chance. Her father was waiting inside. Sheriff Amos Whitmore was a large man, built of the same stubborn rock as the mountains around them. His face, usually set in lines of stern authority, was clouded with a mixture of anger and worry. "Sarah, where have you been? I was about to form a posse." "There was trouble," she said, her voice tired. "The Crow's gang ambushed Deputy Boone. I helped him. We were caught in the storm." Elias stepped forward, his hat in his hand. "Sheriff, it is true. Your daughter saved my life." Amos looked from Elias's bandaged arm to Sarah's disheveled state. He saw the deputy's coat still draped over her shoulders. He looked out the window and saw Mrs. Gable already in a hurried conversation with her neighbor. He let out a long, weary sigh. The sound was full of a father's pain. "Get on home." "Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but hard as iron, "go to your room." "But father, you do not understand." "I understand that my daughter, the daughter of the law in this town, spent the night unchaperoned, with my deputy. I understand what people will make of that. I understand that your reputation, the one I have worked so hard to protect, is now being torn to shreds in the town square. Go home, now." Sarah looked at him, her heart sinking. She saw the implacable set of his jaw. She looked at Elias, whose face was a mask of regret. He could not meet her eyes. The connection they had forged in the storm, that fragile, beautiful thing, was already being buried under the dust of rumor and suspicion. She turned and walked out, her back straight, her head held high. But as she crossed the street, she could feel the weight of the town's eyes on her. She could hear the whispers starting, like the dry rustle of snakes in the grass. Her father had commanded her to stay away from Elias Boone. He was trying to protect her honor, but all she felt was the cold iron of her cage, its door slamming shut once more. The days that followed were made of silence and sideways glances. A wall had been built between the sheriff's office and the sheriff's house, and its architect was Sheriff Amos Whitmore himself. He spoke to Sarah only when necessary, his words clipped and heavy, each one a brick laid in that wall. He forbade her from visiting the office, from running errands that might take her past the jailhouse, from doing anything that might put her in the path of Deputy Boone. It was, he said, for her own good, to let the talk die down. But the talk did not die down. It festered. It burrowed into the foundations of Dust Creek and thrived in the shadows of the saloons and the pale, respectable light of the church pews. Sarah felt it like a change in the weather. Friends who had once greeted her with easy smiles now offered tight, strained nods. The circle of women who gathered around the well each morning would fall silent as she approached, their conversation resuming in urgent whispers the moment she was out of earshot. She was no longer just Sarah Whitmore. She was the woman who had spent the night in the desert with the new deputy. The shame of it was a physical thing, a hot, itchy cloak she could not take off. She saw Elias only from a distance, a glimpse of him crossing the dusty street, his long strides purposeful, the sight of him standing beside her father, a quiet shadow against the glare of the sun. He never looked her way. It was a deliberate act of distance, a compliance with her father's unspoken decree, and it hurt more than the whispers, more than the cold shoulders of the townswomen. The connection they had shared in the storm, that brief, startling moment of understanding, now felt like a dream she had woken from too soon. He was trying to protect her. She knew. He was shouldering the blame by making himself scarce in her world, but it felt like abandonment. The heat of the afternoon was relentless. For 3 days, a brassy sun had beaten down on Dust Creek, baking the very air until it was thin and hard to draw. Sarah was mending one of her father's shirts by the open window, the needle a small silver fish darting in and out of the blue fabric, when she saw young Timothy Rowe, the stable boy, running toward the house. His face was pale beneath a spray of freckles. He skidded to a halt at her porch. "Miss Whitmore!" he panted, his chest heaving. A prospector just rode in. He saw them, the Crow's gang. They hit a freight wagon up near Miller's Pass this morning. The prospector said they were headed south, towards the old canyons. Sarah's needle stopped. The old canyons. That was where the line shack was. It was a maze of red rock and shadow, a perfect place for men to disappear. Her father was over in the next county, meeting with a federal marshal. He would not be back until tomorrow. That left Elias in charge. "Did you tell Deputy Boone?" she asked, her voice sharp with urgency. "Cannot find him," Miss Timothy said, wiping sweat from his brow with a dusty hand. "Sent a boy to the jail, but he is not there. Some say he rode out earlier, checking traps." Sarah's mind raced. Elias was out there, alone, and the men who had ambushed him once were nearby. He had to be warned. This was not about propriety or reputation. This was about a man's life, a life she had saved once already. "Thank you," "Timothy," she said, her decision made in an instant, "you have done well." She did not bother with a bonnet. She strode out of the house and down the street, her steps quick and determined. She ignored the curious stares. She knew where Elias lived, a small, rented cabin at the very edge of town, where the last vestiges of order gave way to the untamed wildness of the desert. It was a place a man would go for solitude. The cabin was small and square, made of sun-bleached wood that had gone gray with age. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a sign he was home. Relief warred with a sudden, sharp nervousness in her chest. She was disobeying her father, walking straight into the fire of the town's gossip. But the thought of Elias riding into another ambush was a greater fire, and it burned away her fear. She raised her hand and knocked on the rough wooden door. "Deputy Boone," she called. "Elias." There was no answer, only the low crackle of the fire within and the buzz of a lazy fly somewhere nearby. She knocked again, harder this time. "Elias, it is Sarah Whitmore. It is urgent." Still nothing. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. What if he was inside, injured? What if his wound from the other day had festered? The door was not latched. It sat ajar, a dark sliver of invitation. She pushed it open. "Elias," she said, stepping inside, "are you here?" The single room was simple, spare, a narrow bed, a small table with one chair, a stone fireplace, and in the center of the room, in the golden shafts of late afternoon light slanting down from a single grimy window, stood a large wooden tub. Steam rose from the surface of the water in lazy, hypnotic curls, and rising from the water were the broad, wet shoulders of Elias Boone. He turned his head at the sound of her voice. His dark hair was damp and slicked back. Droplets of water clung to his eyelashes. His eyes, that faded blue that held so much history, widened in pure, unguarded shock. He was frozen for a long second, his surprise as naked as the rest of him. Then, with a strangled curse, he sank lower into the water, a blush creeping up from his neck to stain his cheeks. Sarah froze too, her hand still on the door, her own face instantly hot with a flush of mortification that felt like it would consume her whole. The scene was bathed in a warm, hazy light, like a painting. The scent of lye soap and hot water filled the air. She saw the hard line of his jaw, the dark mat of hair on his chest just visible above the water, the white, puckered scar that cut across his left shoulder. Her mind, which had been so focused on its urgent message, went completely, utterly blank. The silence stretched, thick and impossibly awkward. It was broken by the sound of a soft splash as he shifted, trying to find a position of greater modesty in the confines of the tub. "Miss Whitmore," he finally managed to say, his voice a low, strangled rasp. "I am so sorry," she stammered, her gaze fixed firmly on a crack in the far wall. "The door, it was open. I knocked. I thought you might be hurt." "I am not hurt," he said, the words tight. "I have news," she rushed on, desperate to fill the charged silence with something other than their shared embarrassment. "About the Crow's gang. A prospector saw them. They are in the South Canyons. I thought you should know. My father is away." He was silent for a moment, processing her words. "Thank you," he said finally. "I will ride out." "Yes, well, I will. I will leave you to it," she said, backing away, her hand fumbling for the door latch. As she turned, her eyes betrayed her and flickered back towards him for a fraction of a second. She saw a flicker of something in his own eyes, something beyond the embarrassment, a flash of humor, maybe, or something warmer. A quiet laugh, low and breathy, escaped him. It was not a laugh of mockery, but one of disbelief at the sheer absurdity of the moment. The sound, so unexpected, made her own lips twitch in a reluctant smile. She turned and fled, pulling the door shut behind her. She did not run, but walked as fast as she could without breaking into an undignified sprint, her face burning. her heart hammering against her ribs. She was halfway down the street when she realized Mrs. Beatrice Miller had been tending the small patch of flowers in her front yard and had watched the entire performance, the sheriff's daughter, marching to the deputy's cabin, entering without an invitation, and then emerging moments later, her face as red as a sunset. Mrs. Miller's eyes were wide, and in them, Sarah saw the next chapter of her ruin being written. Sheriff Amos Whitmore returned that evening to a town buzzing like a disturbed beehive. He did not have to seek out the rumors. They met him on the steps of his own office. He listened, his face growing darker with every embellished detail, his big hands clenching into fists at his sides. He walked home, his boots striking the boardwalk with the force of hammer blows. He found Sarah in the kitchen, pretending to be absorbed in kneading dough for the morning's bread. "You went to his house?" Amos said. It was not a question. It was a judgment. Sarah stopped kneading, her hands white with flour. "I had to. Father, there was news of the Crow's gang. You were gone. He needed to be warned." "You defied me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You walked into that man's house and made a spectacle of yourself, of me, of this family's name. Do you have any idea what they are saying?" "I do not care what they are saying," she retorted, her own anger rising to meet his. "I did what I thought was right. A man's life was at stake." "His life," Amos scoffed, a bitter, ugly sound. "It is your life you should be worried about. Your future. It is ruined. No decent man will have you now. Not in this town." The words were a slap, and she flinched. He had never spoken to her with such cruelty. He turned on his heel and strode out of the house, slamming the door so hard a plate rattled on the shelf. Elias was cleaning his rifle when the sheriff burst into his cabin. The water from his bath was long cold. He had dressed and was preparing to ride out, Sarah's warning echoing in his mind. He looked up and saw the storm on his boss's face. "You are fired, Boone!" Amos roared, his voice filling the small room. "I want you out of Dust Creek by sunup. You have brought nothing but trouble and shame to this town and to my family." Elias slowly set down his rifle, his movements calm and deliberate. He rose to his full height and faced the enraged sheriff. He did not flinch from the older man's fury. "I understand you are angry, Sheriff," he said, his voice even. "Angry does not begin to cover it." Amos spat. "I took you in. I gave you my trust. And you repay me by dragging my daughter's name through the mud. You have dishonored her." Elias stood silent for a long moment, letting the accusations settle in the air between them. He could have explained. He could have told the simple, ridiculous truth of the matter, but he knew it would do no good. The story the town wanted to believe was far more powerful than the truth. An explanation would only sound like a weak excuse, a coward's attempt to shift the blame. Sarah had come to warn him. She had acted out of courage and concern, and she was paying the price. He would not let her pay it alone. He looked past the sheriff. Through the open doorway, he saw a figure standing in the twilight, half hidden in the shadows of the neighboring building. It was Sarah. She had followed her father. She was watching, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and anguish. Elias drew in a slow breath and met the sheriff's fiery gaze. He did not raise his voice. He did not plead his case. He simply stood his ground, a man taking responsibility for a sin he had not committed. "If a man's mistake brings shame on a good woman," he said, his voice low and imbued with a quiet, unshakable gravity, "then he will spend the rest of his life taking it away." The words hung in the air, simple and profound. It was not an apology. It was a vow, a promise so solemn it silenced the sheriff's rage. Amos stared at him, taken aback by the sheer force of the declaration. In the shadows, Sarah heard the words, and they struck her to the very core. He was not talking about a mistake. He was talking about his life. He was laying it down, not in a grand, dramatic gesture, but in a quiet, simple promise to protect her honor. In that moment, the whispers of the town, the anger of her father, the weight of her own shame. It all fell away. All that mattered was the truth she saw in Elias Boone's eyes, and the promise that would change both of their lives forever. Elias Boone's promise did not earn him his job back, not in the way a signed contract would. Sheriff Amos Whitmore was too proud and too stubborn for such a swift reversal. But the words, spoken with such quiet conviction, had been a thunderclap in the small cabin. And they had shaken something loose in the sheriff. He did not tell Elias to leave by sunup. Instead, he had pointed a thick finger at his deputy's chest and said, "You find Crow and his men. You bring them in. Until you do, you are a deputy on probation, and you will stay the hell away from my daughter." He had left without another word, the threat hanging in the air like gun smoke. So Elias Boone remained, but he was a man living on an island. He did his work, but the easy camaraderie of the law office was gone. The town, which had once watched him with wary curiosity, now viewed him with open condemnation. He was no longer the quiet veteran, the new deputy. He was the man who had ruined the sheriff's daughter, the architect of her shame. He did not fight it. He accepted the cold shoulders and the hostile stares as part of his penance. His life narrowed to a single, sharp point: the hunt for the Crow's gang. It was the only way he knew to begin fulfilling his promise. He rode out at dawn and returned after dusk, a ghost in the canyons, his face etched with sun and wind and a fierce, single-minded purpose. He was not just hunting outlaws anymore. He was hunting for a way to restore what had been tarnished. He was hunting for a way to take the shame away. For Sarah, the shame was a constant companion. It sat with her at the dinner table, turning her father's silence into a roaring accusation. It followed her down the main street, a shadow she could not outrun. Her world, once small but secure, had shrunk to the four walls of her house. One morning, she went to the general store for flour and thread. Mrs. Miller, the Reverend's wife, was at the counter, her back ramrod straight as she discussed the price of sugar with the proprietor, Mr. Henderson. When Sarah entered, a sudden chill fell over the store. Mrs. Miller did not turn, but her spine seemed to stiffen even more. Mr. Henderson, a man who had known Sarah since she was a girl in pigtails, suddenly found himself intensely interested in the ledger before him, his face flushing a dull red. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart felt like a trapped bird. "Morning, Sarah," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. She placed her list on the counter. He filled her order in silence, the rustle of the flour sack and the clink of the spools of thread the only sounds in the store. When he was done, she paid him, her coins ringing loudly on the wooden counter. As she turned to leave, she caught Mrs. Miller's reflection in the glass of the candy jar. The woman's eyes were narrow, her lips pressed into a thin line of righteous disapproval. It was a look that condemned her without a trial, a look that stripped her of all decency and left her standing naked and guilty in the middle of the store. The condemnation followed her even to the house of God. On Sunday, she sat beside her father in their usual pew, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the pulpit, but she could feel the stares. She could hear the rustle of dresses and the soft whispers as heads turned in her direction. Reverend Miller's sermon that day was on the sins of the flesh, on the weakness of women who allowed themselves to be led into temptation. He did not use her name, but every eye in the congregation was on her, and his words were like stones cast in her direction. After the service, the circle of women who usually gathered on the steps to chat and exchange pleasantries parted as she and her father approached, a silent, damning judgment that left her feeling utterly alone. A strange and confusing conflict took root in her heart. A hot spark of resentment toward Elias burned within her. Why had he not just explained? Why had he let them all believe the worst? His silence had protected his own pride, but it had cost her everything. He had allowed her to be shamed, had stood by and watched as the town turned against her. The anger was a bitter taste in her mouth. But beneath the anger ran a deeper, quieter current. She would remember the look on his face in the cabin as her father had roared at him. The stillness, the complete absence of defense. He had not tried to save himself. He had seen her standing in the shadows, had understood in an instant the full scope of her predicament, and had chosen to take all the blame onto his own shoulders. His promise had not been a boast or an excuse. It had been an act of profound and selfless honor. And so, while one part of her raged at him for her public humiliation, another part of her felt a powerful, aching compassion for the quiet, lonely man who was riding the high desert day after day, trying to live up to the impossible promise he had made. She was angry at him for the shame he had brought upon her, and she loved him for the way he was trying to carry it for her. One evening, a week after the incident at the cabin, Sarah was summoned to the home of their neighbor, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor's youngest son, Jacob, was burning with a fever, and she was frantic with worry. Dr. Adams had been called, but he was miles out of town, tending to a rancher with a broken leg. "Could you sit with him?" Sarah Eleanor pleaded, her eyes red from crying. "I need to fetch some willow bark from the creek to bring the fever down. I cannot leave him alone." "Of course," Sarah said without hesitation. She sat by the boy's bedside for 2 hours, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth and whispering soothing words. The fever did not break, and by nightfall, Jacob was delirious. Panic began to set in. Dr. Adams had not returned. There was no one else. Then she remembered the saloon. Men gathered there. Sometimes, a man might have some medical knowledge from the war, or from working in a mining camp. It was a long shot, and a place no decent woman would go alone at night, but the boy was getting worse. She left a note for Eleanor and slipped out into the darkness. The Lucky Spur Saloon was a pool of yellow light and raucous noise in the quiet dark of the street. The sounds of a tinny piano and loud, drunken laughter spilled out into the night. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, took a deep breath, and pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon went silent. Every head turned. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. For a woman, especially the sheriff's daughter, to enter the Lucky Spur was unheard of. 50 pairs of eyes, bleary with whiskey and suspicion, stared at her. 2 men, burly and unshaven, detached themselves from the bar and swaggered towards her. She recognized them as Jed and Hank, 2 ne'er-do-wells who worked odd jobs when they were sober, which was not often. "Well now, looky here." "Hank," Jed slurred, a foul-smelling grin on his face. "It is the sheriff's little dove, flown from her cage. What is the matter? Little bird, you looking for your fancy deputy?" His companion chuckled, a low, guttural sound. Maybe she is lonely. Maybe she needs some company. He reached out a grimy hand to touch her arm. Sarah recoiled, her heart pounding. "I am looking for someone who can help a sick child," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "He has a fever." "We can help you with your fever," Jed sneered, stepping closer, blocking her path to the door. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. The other men in the saloon just watched, some with amusement, some with indifference. No one was going to help her. She was tainted goods. Fair game. And then, the swinging doors pushed open again. Elias Boone stepped inside. He had just ridden in from a long day in the canyons, and he was covered in dust, his face drawn with exhaustion. He took in the scene in an instant, Sarah, pale and cornered, and the 2 drunks looming over her. His face, which had been weary, hardened into a mask of cold fury. But he did not draw his gun. He did not raise his voice. He simply moved, placing himself between Sarah and the 2 men. His presence was a silent, solid wall. "That is enough," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that cut through the whiskey-soaked air. Jed, emboldened by drink and an audience, was not deterred. "Stay out of this, Boone. This ain't your business. You have had your turn with her. Maybe it is ours now." He gave Elias a hard shove in the chest. Elias stumbled back a step, but his hands remained at his sides. He did not retaliate. He simply stood there, absorbing the insult. His eyes locked on Jed's. "I said," Elias repeated, his voice even lower. "Even more dangerous. That is enough." The crowd was watching intently now. They were expecting a fight. They were expecting the deputy to defend his honor, and the woman's, with his fists. But Elias refused to give them the show they wanted. He knew that to fight these men would be to sink to their level. It would only confirm the whispers, painting him as a brawling scoundrel fighting over a loose woman. His promise to Sarah was not about violence. It was about honor. Hank, seeing his friend's challenge go unmet, stepped forward and threw a clumsy punch. Elias swayed back, the blow glancing off his shoulder. He did not even flinch. He just stood there, a rock against which their drunken fury broke and dissipated. The two men, faced with this unnerving stillness, this refusal to engage, began to look foolish. Their aggression, met with such profound calm, wilted. They shuffled their feet, their bluster fading. Elias turned his back on them, a gesture of complete dismissal. He looked at Sarah. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, her throat tight with 1,000 unsaid words. "Let me walk you home," he said. He put a hand on the small of her back, a light, protective pressure, and guided her out of the saloon. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of confusion and a dawning, grudging respect. They had come to see a brawl, but they had witnessed something far more powerful. They had seen the difference between a man of true substance and the loud, empty talk of gossips and fools. They walked in silence through the cool night air. The moon was high and bright, painting the dusty street in silver and shadow. When they reached her gate, Sarah stopped and turned to him. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He just nodded, his eyes searching her face in the moonlight. As she watched him walk away, his straight back and steady stride a testament to his character. Sarah understood. Honor was not a fragile thing to be protected from whispers and lies in the parlors of respectable women. It was not a reputation to be polished and displayed. It was a force. It was the quiet strength to stand still in the middle of a storm and not be moved. It was the courage to absorb a blow rather than strike one, to choose dignity over violence. Elias Boone was not taking away her shame by proving the rumors false. He was showing her, and the whole town, that shame dies where honesty and integrity live. And for the first time in weeks, Sarah Whitmore felt the heavy cloak of humiliation begin to fall from her shoulders. The night of the saloon incident did not bring peace. It brought a different kind of quiet, a tense, watchful stillness. The town of Dust Creek held its breath. The whispers had not stopped, but their tone had changed. The open condemnation of Elias Boone had been replaced by a confused, grudging respect. The story of how he had faced down two drunks without throwing a single punch. How he had calmly walked the shamed Miss Whitmore home under the moon. Was a more complicated tale than the simple one they had been telling themselves. It was a story that did not fit neatly into their boxes of sinner and saint. For Sarah, the air was easier to breathe. The stares were still there, but they were no longer sharp with malice. Now they were filled with curiosity. She felt as though she were a puzzle the town was trying to solve. In the silence that still stretched between her and her father, she saw the same confusion. Amos watched his deputy with a new, guarded expression. He saw a man who worked tirelessly, who did not complain, and who met insults with an unnerving calm. The sheriff was a man who understood fists and bullets, but this quiet, unyielding honor was a language he was only just beginning to learn. The fragile truce was shattered on a moonless Thursday night. Sarah was awakened not by a sound, but by a light. An unnatural, flickering orange glow danced on her bedroom wall. It was followed a second later by a sound she knew in her bones, the high, terrified scream of horses. She was out of bed in an instant, pulling on her dress over her nightgown, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She threw open the door, and the scene that met her was one of hell's own making. The livery stable at the end of the street was a roaring inferno, flames leaping high into the black sky, devouring the dry timber with a terrible hunger. Billows of thick, black smoke choked the air, carrying the horrifying sounds of trapped animals and the smell of burning hay and terror. The town was erupting. Men, some only half-dressed, poured from their houses, shouting in confusion and fear. The volunteer fire bell began to clang, a frantic, desperate rhythm in the chaotic night. Sarah saw her father, his face grim in the firelight, already organizing a bucket brigade from the town well. Then the gunshots started. They came from the opposite end of town, from the direction of the assayer's office where the bank kept its strongbox. It was a volley of rifle fire, sharp and disciplined. The fire was not an accident. It was a diversion. "The Crows gang!" Amos roared, his voice cutting through the din. "They are hitting the bank, Henderson. Get your men, protect the office." He turned back to the fire, seeing the immediate, terrible threat. "The rest of you?" "With me. We have to get those horses out." Sarah's blood ran cold. She saw Elias, a rifle in his hand, appear at her father's side. The two men exchanged a look, not as sheriff and disgraced deputy, but as two lawmen facing a common enemy. "I will handle the bank," Elias said, his voice calm and clear amidst the panic. "You are needed here." He turned and ran, rallying a small group of armed townsmen as he went, his commands sharp and precise, the voice of a soldier who knew how to lead men into a fight. Sarah did not hesitate. Her place was not cowering in her house. She ran towards the fire, grabbing buckets, her mind clear and focused. The heat was a physical blow, searing her skin. The smoke was a choking blanket, making her eyes stream. She joined the line of men and women passing buckets from hand to hand, a desperate, futile effort against the roaring beast of the fire. Her father and a few other brave men were at the stable doors, trying to force them open against the heat and the panicked animals within. With a great heave, they broke one of the doors from its hinges. A few horses, their eyes wild with terror, their coats singed, bolted out into the street, but most were trapped. Sarah saw it happen as if in slow motion. A great, burning timber from the stable's roof, groaning under its own weight, finally gave way. It fell in a shower of sparks and embers, right where her father was standing. There was a cry of warning, but it was too late. The beam struck him, a glancing blow, but enough to send him crumpling to the dusty ground. A collective gasp went through the bucket brigade. For a moment, everyone froze. Sarah's heart stopped. "Father," she screamed, dropping her bucket and running forward. Two men were already there, dragging the sheriff's unconscious form away from the crushing heat. His face was pale, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Just then, Elias returned, his face black with soot. The attack on the bank had been repelled. The gang, realizing their diversion had failed to draw all the town's men away, had retreated into the darkness. He took in the scene at a glance: the raging fire, the injured sheriff, the disorganized panic of the townspeople. In that moment, he became the law. "Get him to Dr. Adams' house," he commanded, his voice a whip crack of authority that cut through the fear. "Sarah, go with him. Henderson, take charge of this bucket brigade. Form 2 lines. We need to keep the fire from spreading to the general store." His orders were swift, sure, and logical. The panicked crowd, leaderless a moment before, found its purpose. They moved, their actions now focused and efficient. Sarah, her hands shaking, knelt by her father. His breathing was shallow, his leg clearly broken. She helped the men lift him and carry him towards the doctor's small infirmary. She did not want to leave the fight, did not want to leave Elias, but her father needed her. Dr. Adams, a portly man with kind eyes, worked quickly. He set her father's leg, the sharp crack of the bone snapping back into place, making Sarah feel faint. He cleaned and bandaged a nasty gash on his head, a bad concussion, the doctor said, wiping sweat from his brow, and a broken tibia. "He is a strong man, but he will be off his feet for a long while." Her father was alive. The relief was so profound it left her weak. But the fire still raged. The fight was not over. She left him in the doctor's care and went back outside. The sky was beginning to pale in the east, the coming dawn a strange, ghostly gray against the lurid orange of the flames. The fire was contained now, thanks to Elias's leadership. But the stable was a lost cause, a great, glowing skeleton of charred timbers. Sarah grabbed a bucket and rejoined the line, her movements mechanical, her mind a numb buzz of fear and exhaustion. She worked alongside her neighbors, their faces grim and soot-stained, their differences burned away by the shared crisis. She saw Elias everywhere at once, directing the men, his rifle slung over his back, his presence a steadying force in the lingering chaos. They were working near the back of the stable, dousing the embers that threatened to ignite the adjacent blacksmith's shop, when a section of the weakened wall finally collapsed inward. It fell with a roar, sending a great plume of sparks and superheated air rushing towards them. Sarah was thrown from her feet, landing hard in the mud and ash. For a moment, she was stunned, her ears ringing. A heavy, burning plank landed just inches from her head, its heat scorching her cheek. She was trapped, the world a terrifying swirl of smoke and heat and falling debris. Through the haze, she saw a shape moving towards her. It was Elias. He reached her side, his face a mask of fierce concern. "Are you hurt?" he yelled over the roar. "No," she coughed, the smoke tearing at her lungs. "I am all right." He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her to her feet. Just as he did, another section of the roof gave way, a shower of fire raining down where she'd been lying a second before. They were standing in a small pocket of relative safety, the fire all around them, an island in a sea of flames. In the flickering, hellish light, their eyes met. The world narrowed to the space between them. The smoke, the shouts, the heat, it all faded away. All she could see was his face, streaked with black, his eyes burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with the fire, all the unspoken words, all the suppressed feelings, all the tension that had simmered between them for weeks, came rushing to the surface. It was a moment of pure, terrifying clarity. In the face of death, the lies and whispers of the town were meaningless ash. The only thing that was real was the man standing before her, and the undeniable truth of what she felt for him. He raised a hand and gently brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek, his fingers lingering for a half-second on her skin. The touch was electric, a jolt of life in the midst of destruction. His breath hitched, and she saw in his eyes the reflection of her own feelings, a raw, aching vulnerability. The moment was broken by a shout from Henderson. "It is starting to die down! Keep the water coming!" Elias dropped his hand. The spell shattered. "We have to go," he said, his voice rough. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and led her out of the circle of fire, back to the relative safety of the street. As the sun finally rose, it revealed a scene of devastation. The livery stable was gone, a smoking, blackened ruin. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and despair. But the town had been saved, and Sheriff Amos Whitmore was alive. Sarah found Elias sitting on the steps of the doctor's office, his head in his hands, the picture of pure exhaustion. His shirt was torn, and a long, bloody gash ran down his arm where a burning ember had caught him. She sat down beside him, her own body screaming with fatigue. She carried a small basin of water and a roll of clean bandages from the doctor's supply. She said nothing, but simply took his injured arm and began to clean the wound. Her touch was gentle, practiced. The intimacy of the act, there in the quiet dawn amidst the wreckage of the night, was profound. It was a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. He watched her, his expression unreadable. The blood and soot washed away under her careful hands, revealing the clean, strong line of his forearm. As she tied off the bandage, her fingers brushed against his wrist, and she felt the steady, powerful beat of his pulse. He looked at her then, his eyes clear and full of a deep, weary emotion. The promise he had made in the confines of his small cabin felt like a lifetime ago. It had been a shield, a defense against the town's judgment. Now, it was something else entirely. It was a bond forged in fire and blood. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. He reached up and tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch infinitely tender. The weariness in his face was replaced by a look of fierce, unwavering resolve. "You will never face shame again," he said, his voice resonating with the weight of the night's events. He leaned closer, his gaze holding hers, sealing the vow. "Not while I breathe." In the aftermath of the fire, Dust Creek was a town humbled. The shared struggle had scoured away some of the petty cruelties and suspicions. Men who had looked at Elias Boone with contempt now nodded to him on the street. Women who had whispered about Sarah Whitmore now offered her small, hesitant smiles. They had all seen him, a pillar of calm in the chaos, a leader who had risen when their own had fallen. They had seen her, the sheriff's daughter, her face black with soot, working as hard as any man, her courage a quiet rebuke to their gossip. The fire had been a crucible, and in its heat, reputations had been melted down and were slowly being reforged. Sheriff Amos Whitmore lay in his bed at the doctor's house, his legs splinted and bound, his head throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. He was a man of action, and the forced stillness was a torment worse than the pain. He listened to the reports from his deputy, his pride warring with a deep, grudging gratitude. Elias had saved his town. He had saved his daughter. The debt was a heavy weight on his soul. He still did not approve of the closeness between the two, but he could no longer deny the man's character. He saw the way Sarah looked when Elias's name was mentioned, a soft light in her eyes that had not been there before, and it filled his heart with a father's fierce, helpless love and a profound sense of dread. Elias, for his part, used the town's newfound respect not for his own gain, but as a tool. He now had allies. Men were willing to ride with him, to act as his eyes and ears in the wilderness. His hunt for the Crows gang intensified, fueled by the memory of the fire and the quiet strength he drew from Sarah's gaze. He was no longer just a man trying to clear his name. He was a lawman protecting his town, a man trying to be worthy of the faith a good woman had placed in him. 3 weeks after the fire, his persistence paid off. A tip from a trapper led him to a hidden box canyon deep in the Badlands. He took 2 trusted men with him, and they moved like shadows, their approach silent and swift. They found the gang's camp at dusk. The outlaws, grown careless and confident, were gathered around a small fire. The leader, a man known only as Crow, was a tall, gaunt figure with cold, dead eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. The fight was short and brutal. Elias and his men had the advantage of surprise. 2 of the gang were taken down before they could even draw their weapons. Crow, however, was fast. He came up with a pistol in his hand, but Elias was faster. A single shot from the Winchester sent the pistol spinning from the outlaw's hand. His fingers shattered. He fell to his knees, clutching his ruined hand, his face a mask of agony and pure, undiluted hatred. They brought him back to Dust Creek slung over a horse, his 2 dead companions carried behind him. The town turned out to see them, a silent, awed crowd. Elias Boone had done what Sheriff Whitmore had been trying to do for a year. He had broken the back of the Crows gang. He had brought the man who had burned their stable and threatened their lives to justice. He was a hero. They locked Crow in the larger of the 2 cells in the jailhouse. Dr. Adams tended to his hand, wrapping it in clean bandages. Through it all, the outlaw said nothing, his eyes burning with a silent, venomous fury. The next morning, the town council convened an informal meeting in the sheriff's office. It was comprised of the town's most influential men, Reverend Miller, Mr. Henderson from the general store, and 2 prominent ranchers. Amos, using a pair of crutches, was there, his face pale but resolute. Elias stood beside him. giving his official report. He spoke in his usual quiet, factual manner, detailing the capture. When he was finished, a satisfied murmur went through the room. Mr. Henderson clapped him on the shoulder. "You have done this town a great service. Deputy, a great service." It was then that Crow chose to speak. His voice, when it came from the cell, was a rasping, venomous thing, full of false sincerity. "He has done you a service. All right," he called out, a mocking laugh in his tone. "The service of getting rid of his partners." The room went still. Every eye turned to the cell. "What is that you say?" Reverend Miller asked, his brow furrowed. Crow pushed himself up against the bars, his face a mask of cunning and malice. "Boone here," he said, nodding towards Elias, "was with us from the start. He was supposed to get us the layout of the bank, tell us when the strongbox was full, the fire, the whole thing. It was his idea." A shocked silence filled the office. Elias stood perfectly still, his face unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "That is a lie," Amos said, his voice a low growl. "Is it?" Crow sneered. Ask him why the raid on the bank failed. I will tell you why. Because he got greedy. He figured he could set us up, have us killed, and then take the money for himself later. He double-crossed us. That is the only reason you are not all broken homeless right now." The lie was audacious, monstrous, but it was clever. It preyed on the old suspicions, the lingering questions about the quiet man with no past. Why had he shown up in Dust Creek? Why had he been so quick to find them when the sheriff could not? The seeds of doubt, which had lain dormant since the fire, began to sprout again in the fertile soil of fear and suspicion. Reverend Miller looked at Elias, his face a mask of stern judgment. "Deputy Boone, is there any truth to this outrageous accusation?" "No, sir," Elias said, his voice level. "It is the desperate lie of a guilty man." "But you are an outsider," another councilman said. "We know nothing about you. For all we know, you could have ridden with 100 outlaw gangs before you came here." The atmosphere in the room grew thick with mistrust. The heroism of the fire was forgotten, replaced by the older, more deeply ingrained fear of the unknown. Mr. Henderson, who had just been praising him, now looked at Elias with narrowed, calculating eyes. "Sheriff," Reverend Miller said, turning to Amos, "this is a most serious charge. The word of an outlaw is not to be trusted, of course, but the safety of this town is our first priority. We cannot have a fox guarding the henhouse, for the sake of appearances. For the sake of the law, you must place your deputy under arrest until a circuit judge can come and sort this out." Amos looked at Elias, then at the faces of the councilmen, their expressions a mixture of fear and self-righteous certainty. He was caught in a trap. To refuse would be to undermine his own authority, to be accused of favoritism. His duty, the rigid code he had lived by his entire life, demanded he follow procedure. "I cannot do that," Amos said, his voice rough with an inner turmoil. "You must," the Reverend insisted. "It is your duty." With a heavy heart, a heart that felt as if it were being torn in two, Amos Whitmore nodded. He looked at Elias, his eyes full of a pain and regret that went deeper than words. "Elias," he said, his voice thick, "give me your gun." Elias did not argue. He did not protest. He simply looked at the sheriff, a flash of understanding, of a shared, bitter irony in his eyes. He unbuckled his gun belt and handed it over. The solid metallic sound of the buckle hitting the sheriff's desk was the sound of a good man's life falling apart. They put him in the other cell, the small one, and the iron door clanged shut, a sound of final, terrible injustice. When Sarah heard the news, a cold, hard anger settled in her heart. She stormed into the doctor's house, where her father had returned to his sickbed, his face gray with exhaustion and self-loathing. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a fury he had never seen in her before. "How could you believe the word of a murderer over the man who saved your life, who saved this town?" "It is not about what I believe." "Sarah," he said, his voice weary. "It is about the law. I had no choice." "You always have a choice," she cried, her hands clenched at her sides. "You chose the easy path. You chose to sacrifice an innocent man to appease a group of frightened old men. You call that the law, I call it cowardice." She had never spoken to him that way. The words, sharp and true, struck him harder than any physical blow. He saw in his daughter's blazing eyes not the defiance of a child, but the righteous anger of a woman who understood a justice deeper and more profound than the one he had dedicated his life to upholding. He saw, with a sudden, painful clarity, that she was right. Sarah did not stop there. She went before the town council that evening as they met in the church hall. She stood before them, a lone woman in a room full of powerful men, and she did not flinch. She spoke of the night of the ambush, of how Elias had fought with courage. She spoke of the fire, of how his clear head had saved them all from disaster. She spoke of the night in the saloon, of how he had met insults and violence with a quiet dignity they could not possibly comprehend. "You are willing to believe the lies of a man like Crow because it is easier," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It is easier to believe the worst of a stranger than to admit that you were wrong, that you judged a man unfairly. You wrap yourselves in the law, but you know nothing of justice. You hide behind your reputation, but you know nothing of honor." They listened, their faces impassive. But she had planted a seed. She had forced them to look at their own hypocrisy, and they did not like what they saw. That night, she went to the jail. A young deputy her father had hired to stand guard let her in, his eyes full of pity. Elias was sitting on the edge of the narrow cot in his cell, his back to the door. He did not turn when she approached. "You should not be here. Sarah," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It will only make things worse for you." She stood at the bars, her fingers gripping the cold iron. The light from the single lantern cast long shadows, making the cell look like a cage for a wild, broken animal. "I am not afraid of what they say anymore," she said softly. He finally turned to look at her, and his face was a landscape of despair. All the strength, all the quiet resilience she had come to rely on, was gone. In its place was a bone-deep weariness, a surrender. "You should leave Dust Creek," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Go somewhere new. Somewhere no one knows your name or mine. You can start over. Be free of all this." He was trying to save her. He was trying to fulfill his promise in the only way he had left, by cutting her free from the anchor of his own ruined life. He thought he was offering her an escape. But she saw it for what it was, a deeper kind of prison, a life built on running away. She looked at him, at this good, honorable man who had been so terribly wronged, who was willing to sacrifice his own future for her sake. And in that moment, all the love she had kept locked away in her heart, all the respect and admiration and fierce, protective tenderness, rose up and gave her a strength she never knew she possessed. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, a bell in the silent jailhouse. She met his gaze, and her eyes were shining with a truth that was brighter than any lie. "I would rather be shamed for truth than praised for lies." Sarah's words hung in the silence of the jailhouse long after she had gone. A defiant echo against the cold stone. For Elias, they were a flicker of light in a profound darkness. He had been ready to surrender, to let the slow, grinding injustice of the law take its course. He had accepted his fate as a sacrifice for her future, but her refusal, her declaration that she would choose a shamed truth over a praised lie, had reignited something within him. It was no longer just his life, his honor, on the line. It was theirs. The dawn of the judgment was a spectacle of raw, untamed beauty. The eastern sky bled from a bruised purple into a fiery crimson, silhouetting the jagged peaks of the mountains in black. A low mist clung to the ground, and the air was still and cold, holding its breath for the coming day. It was the kind of dawn that promised either a new beginning or a bloody end. Inside the jail, Elias was awake, watching the colors change through the single, high-barred window. He heard the town begin to stir. The distant crow of a rooster, the clatter of a bucket at the well. He heard the heavy, uneven tread of the young deputy, Ben, pacing the floor of the office, his nerves clearly frayed by the responsibility of guarding 2 prisoners. In the larger cell, Crow was also awake. He was quiet, a coiled snake of a man, and his silence was more menacing than any threat. He had been watching the young deputy all night, measuring his fear, his inexperience. As the first true light of day touched the window, Crow began to moan, a low, guttural sound of agony. He slumped against the bars, clutching his bandaged hand. "Water," he rasped, his voice a dry croak. "For the love of God, boy, my hand, it is on fire." Ben, whose name was Benjamin, but everyone called Ben, hesitated, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Sheriff Whitmore had given him strict orders not to open the cells for any reason, but the man's cries were pitiful, and the thought of him dying of thirst and fever on his watch was a heavy burden for the boy's 19 years. "I will get you some water," Ben said, his voice trying for an authority it did not possess. "But you stay back from the door." Elias listened, every muscle in his body tense. Something was wrong. The timing was too perfect, the acting too theatrical. "Do not do it, Ben," he called out, his voice sharp. "It is a trick." But Ben was caught between the warning of one prisoner and the desperate pleas of another. He chose pity. He filled a tin cup at the water barrel and approached Crow's cell. He slid open the small food hatch at the bottom of the door and pushed the cup through. As he did, Crow, with a speed that was terrifying, lunged. His good hand shot through the opening, not for the water, but for the boy's wrist. He yanked with savage force, pulling Ben's arm hard against the iron hatch. Ben cried out in pain and surprise, dropping his pistol, which clattered on the stone floor. Crow twisted the boy's arm, and a key ring was ripped from his belt. "The gun, you fool!" Ellis roared, but it was too late. Crow's other hand, the bandaged one, snaked through the opening, fumbling for the fallen weapon. He was clumsy, but desperate. Ben, his arm trapped, could only watch in horror. Elias acted. There was no time for thought, only for the brutal calculus of survival. He ripped the thin mattress from his cot, exposing the iron frame. With a surge of adrenaline born of desperation, he jammed one end of the frame into the hinges of his cell door and threw his entire body weight against it. The metal groaned. Once. Twice. On the third heave, there was a screech of tortured metal and the lock housing tore away from the wooden door jamb. The door swung inward with a crash. He was out, in the same motion. He dove for Ben's pistol just as Crow's fingers were closing around it. He was a fraction of a second too late. Crow had the gun. He let go of Ben's arm and scrambled back from the door, his eyes blazing with triumph. At the same time, using the keys, he unlocked his cell door and kicked it open. "You should have stayed in your cage, Boone," Crow sneered, leveling the pistol not at Elias, but at the terrified young deputy. "Now he pays for your heroics." But Crow was not interested in killing a witness who was already locked in the same room. His target was elsewhere. The only person whose testimony truly mattered, the one person whose words could undo all his lies, was Sarah. He backed out of the office, keeping the gun trained on the 2 men, and then bolted into the red light of the dawn. "Sarah," Elias breathed, the name a prayer and a curse. He grabbed Ben by the shirt front. "Is the sheriff at his house?" "No," Ben stammered, his face white with shock. "He is at the church, with the council. They are meeting before the trial." Elias's blood ran cold. The sheriff was not there to protect her. She was alone. He ran from the jail, unarmed, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The street was mostly empty. He saw her at once. She was halfway down the street, walking with a determined stride towards the jail, ready to face the day, ready to speak the truth. And coming up behind her, moving quickly and silently in the shadows of the buildings, was Crow. "Sarah," Elias screamed, his voice raw. She turned at the sound of his voice, her eyes widening in confusion. At the same moment, Crow closed the distance. He grabbed her from behind, clamping a hand over her mouth and pressing the cold muzzle of the pistol to her temple. Not a step closer. Boone, Crow snarled, dragging her backwards, or the pretty little liar gets her brains scattered all over this dusty street. Elias froze, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. His mind raced. There was no one else around. It was just them, a tableau of life and death under the bloody sky. "Let her go, Crow," Elias said, his voice low and steady, trying to keep the man's attention focused on him. "It is me you want." "Oh, I want you," Crow said with a venomous grin. "But first, I am going to get some insurance. We are going for a little ride. You are going to stay right here, or she dies. Understand?" He began to pull Sarah towards the ruins of the livery stable, where a few tethered horses remained. Elias knew with a sickening certainty that if Crow got her out of town, she would never be seen alive again. He had to act now. As Crow dragged her past the alleyway beside the blacksmith's shop, Elias took a calculated risk. He sprinted, not at them, but into the alley, disappearing from view for a precious second. He emerged at the other end, in the back lot behind the buildings. He was now parallel to them, hidden by a stack of old barrels. He had closed the distance, but he was still unarmed and exposed. Sarah, her mind reeling with terror, felt a surge of the same fire she had felt in the saloon. She was not a helpless victim. She would not be a pawn in this man's game. As Crow's attention was momentarily diverted by Elias's disappearance, she stomped down with all her might on his instep with the hard heel of her boot. He roared in pain, his grip on her loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth, tasting the salt and grit of his skin. He cursed and yanked his hand away, and in that instant, she threw her head back, connecting with his nose with a solid crack. He stumbled back, dazed, his grip on her gone. The pistol wavered in his hand. It was the opening Elias had prayed for. He burst from behind the barrels, a human battering ram, and slammed into Crow, driving him to the ground. The pistol flew from the outlaw's grasp, skittering across the dusty ground. The two men rolled, a tangle of limbs and furious curses. Elias was stronger, but Crow was a feral, vicious fighter. He pulled a knife from his boot, the blade gleaming in the dawn light. Sarah screamed as the knife flashed, arcing towards Elias's throat. Elias caught the man's wrist, their arms locked in a deadly stalemate, muscles straining. He saw the cold, murderous light in Crow's eyes and knew this was a fight to the death. Sarah, seeing the dropped pistol, scrambled for it. Her fingers closed around the cool metal grip. She had never pointed a gun at a man before, but she did not hesitate. She raised it with both hands, the barrel shaking, trying to get a clear shot at Crow without hitting Elias. Seeing her with the gun, Crow made a desperate move, with a final, savage heave. He broke Elias's grip and rolled away, kicking out and catching Elias in the ribs. Elias gasped in pain, and in that moment, Crow lunged, not for Elias, but for Sarah. He was fast. He grabbed her wrist, trying to wrench the gun from her hand, but as he lunged, his body was exposed. Elias, still on one knee, saw his chance. He had been carrying his own knife in his boot, a habit from the war he had never broken. He drew it now, a fluid, deadly motion. He did not throw it. He surged forward, driving the blade home with a single, desperate thrust. Crow's body went rigid. A look of stunned surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the hilt of the knife protruding from his side, then back at Elias. The gun in Sarah's hand went off, the sound a deafening roar in the enclosed space. The bullet went wide, but it did not matter. Crow swayed on his feet, his mouth opening in a silent scream, and then he crumpled to the ground, a still, lifeless heap in the dust. Silence. The echo of the gunshot faded, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing. It was over. Elias pushed himself to his feet, his side screaming in protest from where Crow had kicked him. He looked at Sarah. She was pale, her eyes wide with shock. But she was alive. She was safe. "Sarah," he breathed, taking a step towards her. And then he saw the small, dark stain spreading on the front of his own shirt. He looked down, a strange, detached curiosity on his face. He had not even felt it. In the chaos of the final lunge, Crow must have gotten a shot off, a last, desperate, dying act of malice. He pressed a hand to his stomach, and his fingers came away wet and red. A sledgehammer blow of pain and shock hit him all at once, and his legs buckled. He fell to his knees, the world tilting and fading to gray at the edges. Elias Sarah's scream was a raw, broken sound. She was at his side in an instant, dropping the gun, her hands hovering over his wound, afraid to touch him. She tore a long strip from the hem of her dress, her movements frantic, her mind a numb fog of terror. She pressed the makeshift bandage to the wound, her hands instantly slick with his blood. "Stay with me, Elias," she pleaded, her voice choked with sobs. "Please, stay with me." He looked up at her, his face pale, his breathing shallow. He tried to speak, but only a soft sigh escaped his lips. She gathered him into her arms, cradling his head in her lap, oblivious to the blood and the dust. The sun was cresting the mountains now, flooding the desert with a brilliant, clean light. It was in that moment that the town arrived. A small crowd, led by a frantic, crutch-wielding Amos Whitmore, rounded the corner of the blacksmith's shop. They stopped, frozen by the scene before them. They saw the body of the outlaw, dead in the dust, and they saw their hero, the man they had condemned, bleeding out in the arms of the woman they had shamed. Sarah held Elias close, her tears falling onto his face, mingling with the blood and the red dust of the Arizona dawn. The shame was gone, burned away by sacrifice. The lies were silenced, washed away by a truth that was as undeniable and as brilliant as the rising sun. All that was left was the man she loved, and a desperate, fragile hope that this new day would not be his last. The world swam back into focus for Elias Boone, not as a sound or a sight, but as a sensation, a deep, searing fire in his belly that was tethered to a vast, empty weakness. He was floating in a gray sea of pain, and the only anchor was the cool, constant pressure of a hand on his forehead. He knew the touch of that hand. It was the same hand that had bandaged his arm in a line shack during a storm, the same hand that had cleaned the soot from his face after the fire. It was Sarah's hand. He did not know how long he had been in that gray sea. Days, perhaps a week. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his world a fevered dream of smoke and blood and the distant, muffled sound of voices. But always, the hand was there. Sometimes he would open his eyes just a crack and see her, a silhouette against the lamplight, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, her eyes never leaving him. He would see Dr. Adams, his brow furrowed in concentration, changing dressings and forcing bitter medicine between his lips. He would see the stooped, broken figure of Sheriff Amos Whitmore, sitting silently in a corner of the room, a man haunted by the ghosts of his own choices. The town of Dust Creek, shamed into a collective silence, became a congregation of penitents. The whispers died, replaced by a quiet, steady stream of offerings left on Dr. Adams's porch. A freshly baked loaf of bread from Mrs. Henderson, a jar of beef broth from a rancher's wife who had once stared at Sarah with contempt, a carefully stitched quilt from the women of the church sewing circle, laid gently over the doctor's spare bed where Elias fought for his life. They were small, silent apologies, a town's clumsy attempt to atone for its sins of judgment. They could not take back their words, but they could offer up their bread and their broth, hoping it would be enough. Sarah accepted it all with a quiet, solemn grace. She was the gatekeeper, the guardian of the sick room. She rarely spoke, but her eyes, when she met the gazes of the townspeople, were clear and steady, devoid of accusation. There was no triumph in her vindication, only a profound, weary sorrow. She had won her truth, but the price had been devastatingly high. The fever broke on the 8th day. Elias woke to a world that was sharp and clear. The pain in his side a focused, manageable thing instead of an all-consuming fire. Sarah was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arms. In sleep, the lines of worry on her face softened, and she looked young, vulnerable. He watched her for a long time, a feeling of such overwhelming love and gratitude swelling in his chest that it almost hurt more than the bullet wound. He had made a promise to take away her shame, and in the end, she had saved him from his own despair. When she woke and found him watching her, a slow, radiant smile spread across her face, chasing away the shadows. It was the first true smile he had seen from her, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. His recovery was slow and arduous. The bullet had torn through muscle and sinew, narrowly missing anything vital, but it had left a deep and angry wound. For weeks, he was confined to the bed, his strength seeping away, leaving him as weak as a newborn. Sarah was his constant nurse, his strength, his reason to fight through the pain and the weakness. She read to him from worn copies of Shakespeare and Mark Twain, her voice a soothing balm. She spooned broth into his mouth when he was too weak to lift his own hand, and in the long, quiet hours of the night, they talked, their voices low whispers in the lamplight. They unwound the tangled threads of their lives, sharing the stories and the sorrows that had shaped them, forging a bond that was stronger than steel, more precious than gold. Amos Whitmore was a frequent visitor. He would sit by the bed, his crutches resting against the wall, and watch his daughter tend to the man he had wronged. The sight was a constant, sharp reminder of his own failure. He had been so obsessed with the letter of the law, with the preservation of a fragile, surface-level honor, that he had failed to see the true justice, the true honor, that was right in front of him. He had mistaken public opinion for truth, and in doing so, had nearly destroyed the two people he loved most in the world. One afternoon, when Elias was strong enough to sit up in bed for a short while, Amos came to see him alone. Sarah had gone home for a much-needed rest. The two men sat in a heavy silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. "I was wrong, Elias," Amos said finally, his voice a low, gravelly thing. He did not look at Elias, but at his own large, useless hands resting on his lap. "I was a proud, blind old fool. I let the whispers of gossips matter more than the evidence of my own eyes. I failed you. I failed my daughter. I failed this town." Elias said nothing. He simply listened. Knowing the confession was a weight Amos had to unburden. "I am done," Amos continued, a note of finality in his voice. "A man who cannot tell the difference between a real threat and a phantom one has no business wearing a badge. This town needs a new kind of lawman, not one who just enforces the rules, but one who understands what is right. It needs you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tin star, the symbol of his authority, the center of his identity for 30 years. It was worn and scratched, but it shone with a dull, honest gleam in the afternoon light. He held it out to Elias. "I am resigning," he said. "The council has already agreed. The badge is yours, if you will have it." Elias looked at the star resting in the old man's calloused palm. He thought of the promise he had made, to spend his life taking away Sarah's shame. He had thought it meant proving his innocence, but he saw now that it meant something more. It meant building a world where such shame could not take root. It meant creating a community based not on fear and suspicion, but on truth and understanding. "I will," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. He took the star from Amos's hand. It felt heavy, a weight of responsibility, a promise to the future. Months passed. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. Dust Creek began to heal. Under the quiet, steady leadership of Sheriff Elias Boone, a new sense of order took hold. It was an order based not just on fear of punishment, but on a shared sense of fairness and respect. Sarah found her own way to build the future. She had seen how ignorance and fear had nearly torn their lives apart. She decided that Dust Creek needed more than just a new sheriff. It needed a new way of thinking. In the small, abandoned building that had once been a failed tailor's shop, she opened a school. It was not just for the children. In the afternoons, after the lessons on reading, writing, and arithmetic were done, she held classes for the women of the town. She taught them history. She read them poetry. She opened up a world beyond the confines of their kitchens and sewing circles. At first, only a few came, hesitant and curious, but Sarah's passion was infectious. Soon, the small schoolroom was full, the air buzzing with the excitement of mind waking up to new ideas. The women who had once been the arbiters of her shame were now her eager pupils. Shame, she was discovering, could not long survive in the bright, clear light of knowledge. One warm evening, as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple, Sarah walked from the schoolhouse to the small cabin at the edge of town. It was Elias's cabin, but it was their home now. A new room had been added on, built with the help of men from the town, and a porch now ran the length of the front, with 2 rocking chairs to catch the evening breeze. She found him on the porch, sitting in a large wooden tub, the water steaming in the cool evening air. The deep, puckered scar on his side was a pale, silvery line against his skin, a permanent reminder of the price they had paid. He had his eyes closed, his head leaning back against the rim of the tub, a look of peaceful exhaustion on his face. The scene was a quiet echo of the one that had started it all. The memory of her mortification, of the town's scandalized whispers, felt like a story from another lifetime, about 2 different people. She walked up the steps, carrying a bucket of hot water from the stove to top off his bath. The sound of her footsteps made him open his eyes. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that was just for her. She poured the water in, the steam rising to mist her face. She set the empty bucket down and leaned against the porch railing, looking at him. The love she felt was a quiet, deep, and steady thing, as solid and real as the ground beneath her feet. "You know," she said, a playful light dancing in her eyes, "for the chief lawman of this town, you are awfully careless with your privacy." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that rumbled in his chest. "I have nothing to hide anymore." "Perhaps," she said, her lips curving into a teasing smile, "but you might want to consider the reputation of the local schoolteacher." She reached out and gently traced the line of his scar with her fingertip. "You should lock the door this time, Sheriff." He caught her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her fingers. His eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw the reflection of their entire story. The shame, the sacrifice, the fire, and the hard-won peace. He had kept his promise. He had spent his life, and had nearly lost it, taking away her shame. But they had learned together that the only way to truly kill shame was to refuse to live by its rules. They had chosen to live in the light, to face the world with an honesty that was more powerful than any lie. And in that honest, open space, shame had simply withered and died, starved of the darkness and secrecy it needed to survive. The dust never left. That was the one truth of the Arizona Territory that held fast against the relentless march of time. But the dust of 1894 was different from the dust of 1876. It settled on a different world. The iron rails of the railroad had come, a great, shining snake cutting through the desert, bringing with it new people, new money, and new ideas. Dust Creek was no longer an isolated outpost. It was a town with a future, a stop on the map to somewhere else. The main street now had boardwalks on both sides, a 2-story brick hotel where the old assayer's office had been, and a proper church with a tall, white steeple that seemed to rebuke the endless, indifferent blue of the sky. The burned-out shell of the livery stable was long gone, replaced by a much larger structure that smelled of fresh-cut lumber and new money. The wind still blew, and the sun still beat down with a fierce, possessive heat. But the town no longer felt like it was on the verge of being scoured from the earth. It had put down roots, deep and stubborn. Sarah Boone, who had once been Sarah Whitmore, watched this new world from the porch of her house. It was the same small cabin Elias had once rented, but it was almost unrecognizable now, expanded and improved over the years, with a garden of stubborn, hardy flowers she coaxed from the dry soil. At 42, the lines of worry and sorrow from her youth had softened into a quiet, confident grace. She was the town's schoolteacher, a respected figure, a woman whose opinion was sought and valued. The cage she had once felt so keenly had long since rusted away into memory. Elias was still the sheriff. The tin star was pinned to a vest that was a little tighter around the middle now, and his dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, the wound in his side, a souvenir from a dead man's last act of hate, ached on cold winter mornings, a dull, physical echo of the past. His job had changed with the town. There were fewer desperate outlaws and more disputes over land and water rights, fewer gunfights and more of the complicated, messy business of civilization. He was a good sheriff, known for being fair and quiet and unshakable. The town trusted him completely. The old whispers, the old slanders, were a forgotten language from a forgotten time. They had a daughter. Her name was Hannah, and she was 7 years old, with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady, thoughtful blue eyes. She was a child of the New West, a child of the peace her parents had fought so hard to build. One evening, as the sun began its slow, spectacular descent, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, Sarah sat on the porch swing with Hannah tucked beside her. Elias was not home yet, having ridden out to settle a disagreement between two ranchers. Amos, her father, sat in one of the rocking chairs, a frail but contented old man, his leg permanently stiff from the old injury. He spent most of his days on this porch, watching the world change, his heart at peace. "Tell me a story, Mama," Hannah said, her voice a small, clear bell in the quiet air. "Tell me the one about the brave deputy and the angry fire." It was a story Sarah had told her many times, sanded down and simplified for a child's ears. A fairy tale stripped of its sharpest, most painful edges. In the story, the deputy was a hero. The townsfolk were frightened but good at heart, and the sheriff's daughter was a brave helper. It was a story of courage and adventure. Sarah began the tale, her voice a low, familiar cadence. She spoke of the blistering sun and the endless dust, of a brave lawman who came to a lonely town. She spoke of a terrible fire that lit up the night sky, and how the brave deputy had saved everyone. Hannah listened, her eyes wide, leaning her head against her mother's shoulder. When the story was over, the first stars were beginning to prick the deep purple of the twilight sky. Hannah was quiet for a long moment, her small brow furrowed in thought. "Mama," she said, her voice soft and serious, "in the story, did people say mean things about the sheriff's daughter?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Children had a way of seeing the cracks in a story, the places where the truth had been patched over. She looked at her daughter, at her innocent, questioning face, and she knew a fairy tale was no longer enough. "Yes, darling," she said, her voice gentle. They said very mean things. They did not understand her, and they were afraid, and so they used words to try and hurt her." "Weren't you afraid?" Hannah asked, her voice a whisper. "When they said those things, weren't you afraid of what everyone thought?" Sarah looked out over the town, at the warm yellow lights beginning to glow in the windows of the houses. She saw the new steeple of the church, and remembered a time when she had felt the weight of every eye in that congregation upon her. She felt the old, phantom sting of shame, a ghost of a feeling that no longer had the power to haunt her. She thought of the women who had turned their backs on her, women who were now her friends, who sent their own daughters to her school to learn about the world. She thought of Elias, of his quiet, unyielding honor, of the promises he had made and kept with his actions, not his words. She pulled her daughter a little closer, the warmth and solid reality of her a comfort against the chill of the memory. She chose her next words carefully, not for the child beside her, but for the young, frightened woman she had once been. "I was terrified," she admitted, the truth of it still sharp after all these years. "For a long time, their words felt like a prison. It felt like the whispers were the only thing people would ever know of me. I was afraid that the things they said would become the truth of who I was." She paused, watching the distant shape of a lone rider approaching the town on the dusky trail. It was Elias. His day's work done. Coming home. "But I was wrong," she continued, her voice growing stronger, filled with a conviction that had been forged in fire and tempered by love. "I was afraid for a long time, only until I learned the West doesn't remember whispers, only deeds." Hannah looked up at her, not fully understanding the words, but sensing the deep, unshakable truth behind them. "The things people say," Sarah explained, stroking her daughter's hair, "are like smoke. They sting your eyes and choke you for a little while, but then the wind comes and they are gone, and nothing is left behind. But what people do, a kindness, an act of courage, a promise kept, those are like stones. You can build a life on them. You can build a town on them. This whole town. This peace we have. It was not built with words. It was built by your father's courage and your grandfather's wisdom, and by all the people who chose to put down their judgment and pick up a bucket on the night of the fire. The whispers die, Hannah, but the deeds are what you are remembered for. The deeds are what last." Elias rode up to the house then, dismounting with the weary grace of a man who had spent a long day in the saddle. He smiled as he saw them on the porch, a tired but deeply contented smile. He came up the steps and kissed Hannah's forehead, then leaned down and kissed his wife, a soft, familiar gesture that spoke of years of shared sunsets and quiet understanding. He sat in the rocking chair beside Amos, and the four of them sat in a comfortable silence, a small island of peace in the vast, gathering darkness of the desert, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. They were a family built not on a flawless reputation, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of a truth they had fought for, and a love that had proven stronger than any lie. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight, and we invite you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.